Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Career Journey Podcast. I'm your host, Brittany Avila. On today's episode, we have Dr. Arman Taghizadeh, also known as Dr. T, and he is a board-certified adult, child, and adolescent psychiatrist specializing in sports psychiatry. And more recently, he is a founder of the Mindset Training Institute, and he hosts his own podcast, The Mindset Experience. He grew up in Baltimore and competed in NCAA Division I wrestling, and he knew that he wanted something to do with teaching and coaching and helping people. But he also was really drawn to the medical field because of his father. And so he went to medical school. And in this episode, we talk all about that journey, what it's like being in medical school, how he chose and how most people in medical school choose a specialization, how he ended up going into psychiatry. And then another really interesting part of this episode is that we dive really deep into networking and making connections and putting yourself out there. And because Dr. T works with adult children and adolescents all together, we talked about how anxiety even affects our networking. So how do we network when we are anxious or nervous or, like me, introverted and a little scared to put yourself out there? So we have a really good conversation on that. So if you're interested in medical school and psychiatry, or if you just want some information on how to network and how to put yourself out there to make connections, this is a great episode for you. So without further ado, please enjoy Dr. T. Hey everyone, welcome to the Career Journey Podcast, where we explore exciting careers and how to get them from the people who've lived it. I'm your host, Dr. Brittany Avila. Thank you for tuning in and enjoy. Well, thanks for coming on. And let's just get started. So I usually like to start from the very beginning. Did you have any ideas of what you wanted to be when you were a child growing up?
Yeah, so it's interesting. When I grew up, my initial goal was to be a teacher and a coach. Grew up as an athlete, played multiple different sports, really found my passion with competitive wrestling and was really drawn to like the coaches that motivated me. And like I was always working out and training. And so like my goal was I want to be a teacher and a coach. My mom was strongly encouraging me to go into another field, one that maybe was a little bit more sustainable, a little bit more financially rewarding, and really kept imparting on me the fact that, that these teachers and coaches, they work really hard, they work long hours, but it's generally underappreciated, they're underpaid, and sort of felt like that I could do something that would be more financially sustainable. So she really actually, both her and my father really kind of pushed me more towards higher levels of education and really, encouraged me to pursue a career maybe in medicine. But it wasn't something that I was interested in. And I actually didn't love science or I didn't love the medical field. But I wanted to be a teacher and a coach. So that was my initial goal. And then I ultimately became a physician. So it's interesting. And we can talk about sort of how I'm living out some of my passion now and what I do.
Yeah, well, there's definitely some parallels in what you do, especially in being a physician. I mean, there's a lot of teaching involved in that. So where did you go next? You said you went in, your parents kind of pushed you into medicine. I'm assuming you went to medical school?
Yeah, so my dad was a physician, I should say that. So I grew up
Okay.
the son of a physician. My parents were I was first generation American. So my parents actually met in the States, but they were both from the Middle East. And so my dad grew up really humble, grew up really poor actually, and really worked his way through medicine and medical school. And the reason I bring that up is, even being the son of a physician, my dad was always working. So I never saw my father. He worked late hours, he worked weekends, and really was doing that to kind of help support our family. Now, my mom was in education, actually. She taught in the School of Medicine at the University of Maryland, which is, we live in the Baltimore area, but was not a physician. And so, again, that concept of wanting to be a teacher and a coach was kind of always something. So what I actually ended up doing is I went to college. I wrestled in college at the Division I level, and then I actually took a year off after college and was a teacher. I was a middle school teacher and a high school wrestling coach. And it was during that year that I started to kind of think about what I wanted to do next. And I had taken psychology classes, I had taken pre-med classes because I wanted to sort of set myself up and see what I wanted to do if I wanted to go that route. And it was during that year that I thought, you know what, I think I want to apply to medical school. I knew that I knew that I was intelligent. I had done well in college. As a teacher, I realized that it wasn't, there were more struggles that I was aware of. It was definitely challenging. It was difficult. Even though the hours are quote unquote 8 to 3, like you're working a lot afterwards. And it was
Yeah.
incredibly rewarding, but also allowed me to see that, you know what, like I think I want to do something else. So let me apply to medical school and see if this is something that I want to do. And if I'm fortunate enough to get in, because I didn't know if I would get in, it's incredibly challenging.
Right.
It's incredibly difficult. And I also thought if I have an opportunity to get in and I don't take advantage of it, then I'm really selling myself short. So I took that year off. I taught, I coached, had a great experience, was able to travel a little bit throughout Europe and kind of live life before, getting into medical school, which really kind of limits your young adulthood to some extent. But I did get in
Yeah.
ultimately, and got into the University of Maryland School of Medicine. And so went
Great.
to med school there and then ended up deciding to go into psychiatry, and really kind of working with people and creating relationships and ultimately kind of teaching and coaching, which is what I do now in a different realm. But so I did my residency at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, both in adult psychiatry and then specializing in child and adolescent. So when it was all said and done, 13 years of education after high school,
Yeah.
I started my career, I guess, at the ripe age of 31 or 32. So
Oh, I'm right there with you. I think I started at around 31 and I didn't go to med school. How did you make that decision to pursue psychiatry when you were in med
yeah,
school?
so it's interesting. So one, I was exposed to it because my dad was a psychiatrist actually. So I was exposed to it in that, I had seen, I knew that's what he did. I knew a little bit about it. I also had met people. I'd gone to school with kids that actually, my father was their doctor. And so he wouldn't say anything, but they would sort of say, look, your dad's my doctor and he's really helped me. And so like I started to hear the impact he was making on other people's lives and on other kids' lives. And I thought, man, that's really cool. Like I know my dad is like this guy that's really strict. I don't see him a lot, but when I see him, there's all these rules and he's, you know, always kind of educating me on my behavior and my attitude and, like, what it means when I'm talking back and if I'm trying to exert myself. And he's trying to do all this psych stuff on me. And I was like, but then I'm hearing all these other kids that are like, your father's helping me and this is so cool. And we would go out sometimes at like a restaurant or the grocery store and kids would be like, hey, Dr. T. They used to call him Dr. T as well. And so there was this sort of thing of like, this is really cool that there's something bigger than it. So I went to med school. And then also I had done I'd gotten some experience working in a psychiatric hospital, working with kids, teaching in a school with psychiatrically disturbed kids or emotionally disturbed kids is probably a better way of saying it. So I'd had some experience and went to med school thinking I wanted to do something and help with people. Now, when I got to med school, it's interesting. For anybody that's been in medical school, they know this, but for anyone who hasn't, you go to med school in the first 2 years, you're basically in classes and everybody takes the same classes. The last 2
Okay.
years in med school, you go through every rotation. So everybody goes through surgery. Everybody goes through OBGYN. Everybody learns how to deliver a
Okay.
baby. Everybody learns how to operate. Everybody learns how to, you know, uh, learns pediatrics. So everybody learns psychiatry. So you go through and you have these like basically 2 or 3 month rotations in most of the fields of medicine. And so everybody gets experience learning all of that. And you sort of then decide, I want to specialize in surgery. I want to specialize in OBGYN, or I want to specialize in pediatrics, or I want to specialize in psychiatry. And so initially, I went in sort of being exposed to psych, thinking that's something I would be interested in. But then actually really started to identify with some of the more surgical fields. I was an athlete. My friends were all athletes. Even in med
Mhm.
school, I was always working out. I used it as a release. I used it as a sense of discipline. When things got difficult, I always went back to like the challenging workouts I had done when I was competing and also continued to do. So that mentality of always sort of pushing yourself, working together as a team, having a sense of accomplishment, a little bit of pain, all those things were things that were instilled in me. And so I really started to navigate or gravitate towards the surgical fields. And I didn't want to do surgery necessarily because I didn't love sort of that concept, but the idea of anesthesia really stuck out at me. And I thought, you're in the operating
Yeah.
room, you're working as a team, everybody's working together. There's like a process at the end, you're playing music at the end, everybody's like metaphorically high-fiving, you all win and you leave, right? And I was like, this is so cool to work as a team. But and no disrespect to my anesthesia colleagues, but the job itself wasn't appealing to me, right? People equated it, and I've
Okay.
heard it be equated to like an airline pilot. Like the takeoff and the landing are exciting, but if everything's going well, it's just kind of smooth. Well, that's not
Yeah.
exciting to me, right? And I also don't want to be in the operating room getting yelled at by surgeons because I need to do this or I need to do that. Like that's not how I operate. So I started to ultimately say, well, what is it that I really want to do? And I also kind of came to this conclusion of, I love the attitude and the mentality in the operating room, but I also thought, look, you don't go into a field because you want best friends. Like if I'm going into medicine because I want to be best friends, I want to go into anesthesia because I want to hang out with people in the operating room. That's not the right attitude. And ultimately, if that was the case, I probably wouldn't go into medicine to begin with because my
Right.
peers and my like-minded individuals were going into like sales or they were going into coaching or they were, continuing to train and compete. I had colleagues that were going into like the MMA and all that stuff. So ultimately, what brought me back to psych was this idea that I had gotten exposed to it. I'd seen the way that you can make an impact on people. I loved building relationship. I loved helping people become better versions of themselves. I also thought what was interesting about psychiatry is that, like, one person's depression is different than another person's depression, or one person's anxiety is
Mhm.
different than another person's anxiety. And so there's a biological component, a medical component. There's a behavioral component. We all make choices in terms of how we approach things. Our environments are all different. So our life story kind of impacts our experiences and our medical conditions. So you're sort of sorting through, and everybody's experience is so individual. And to me, that was similar to kind of coaching, right? Because people come in with different, you can all play the same sport, but everybody's experiences are different. What they come in with is different. Some come from athletic backgrounds or athletic families. Some people have innate talents and experiences. Other people have to kind of work at it. But in order to become the best version of yourself, you have to sort of bring all that out. And in order to be a great coach, you have to sort of identify that and coach people differently, right? And to me, that was the closest thing in medicine, um, to psychiatry. And so I thought, this is something I want to do. And again, I think that that connection with my father was important and seeing that. And so ultimately, I decided I was going to a psychiatry, identifying and knowing that I wasn't sort of your stereotypical psychiatrist, right? I was a young guy, I was athletic, I was still working out. Um, but I thought if I can do this my way and be authentic in who I am, I'm going to be more relatable to the people that I work with. And I wanted to work with kids because, again, I really enjoyed that aspect of teaching and coaching. And so ultimately, I went into psych, sort of develop a niche and a specialization in working not only with, kids who have anxiety and depression and ADHD and kind of your more typical psychiatric symptoms, but also specializing in athletes and kind of elite um, coaches and parents and kind of elite performers and understanding that my experiences that I had before, as well as my medical knowledge, as well as my mental health experience now could sort of tie together and really be able to provide an opportunity to support this population in a way that a lot of times I think they're vulnerable, they're more vulnerable to some extent, but also have less
Mhm.
access or willingness to get help. And so again, having those experiences and being able to tie it together sort of put me back in that operating room, if you will, working with the team,
Right.
right? Working with the kid and the parent and the coach, you know, and the organization, and being able to sort of be in that position to help them kind of orchestrate it, but more from kind of a mental, psychological, emotional standpoint.
Great. Blending everything you wanted to do pretty
Yeah, it's
much.
wild how it kinda worked out, but this is, I'm in 11
Yeah.
years of my career now, so it's sort of evolved over the years, and, I've
Right.
established enough of a reputation, both professionally and personally, that's allowed me to also be able to kind of do what I have to do and then be able to kinda grow in the way that I want to, and be able to really kinda take my passions and my experiences and start to really love what I do. I think medicine is a field that anyone who's in it can attest that there's a point where it becomes really hard to enjoy it, right? The system is
Yes.
set up really to fail. It's a broken system. It's really hard to provide great care to patients. given the way things are, with insurance companies and the way things are limited. And in the psychiatric world, it's even the resources are even more limited. And especially now, there's just such a shortage of psychiatrists. There's such a high need for mental health. And so it's really, really difficult. And it's very easy to become disenfranchised. It's really, they use the term burnout a lot. Moral injury is another one that we use a lot. And so by doing it the way that I'm doing it now, I'm able to kind of rekindle that childhood dream and that passion, be able to really kind of motivate myself to get excited and jazzed about what I do. And ultimately that allows me to do a better job.
Right. And you mentioned earlier a little bit about how medical school works, where you kind of do basically classes in the beginning, and then you start to experiment with the different specializations. Once you decide on the specialization, what happens after that?
So once you decide, like in my case, I want to be a psychiatrist. Now what happens is you've done 4 years of medical school. So everybody does 4 years of medical school. Now you apply for what's called a residency. So a residency is going to be a program that's more specialized in your field. And it varies depending on the field that you go into. So for example, a psychiatric residency, which typically when you go into a psychiatric residency, it's a general adult residency. So you have to do adults first. It's not typical for everybody. Okay. That's 4 years. And then if you want to do a specialization in kids and adolescents, that's another 2 years. So if you want to go into surgery, general surgery is typically 5 years. If you want to go into like plastic surgery or orthopedic surgery, usually that's another couple years. Pediatrics, I think, is 3 or 4 years, and so each of them are a variation, let's say between 3 and 5 years. And then it adds on to it if you want to get further specializations. And there's combined programs, there's all different things. But the reality is that, we go from, first grade to high school, that's 12 years of school, right? If you want to go further, then you've got 4 years of college, you've got 4 years of med school. So now you've got an additional 8 years of higher education. And then on top of it, you've got your residency, where you're technically a physician, you've graduated medical school, you are a medical doctor, you have a medical license, but now what's happening is you're training within your field. So you have supervisors and mentors, and even within that, you have rotation. So in my field, psychiatry, my first year was actually all medicine. I worked at a hospital that was all very little psychiatry. So I was on a medical floor. My first month ever, I was in the cardiac intensive care unit. Here I am, fresh out of med school, intending to be a psychiatrist. And now I'm taking care of the most critically ill patients in the whole hospital, in the cardiac ICU. So these guys, cardiac surgeries, they're really, really, and here I am, right out of med school, I don't know anything. And I'm thrown into the deep end. And so that was an incredibly humbling learning experience. But I learned a lot about like how to take care of sick people and really understand medicine, which I think whatever field you're in is so important to have. I did a month of medical intensive care, medical ICU, right? I did neurology, I did medicine, I did psychiatry. So my first year actually of residency where I trained at Hopkins was really a compilation. And they really believe that if you're going to be any kind of doctor, you really have to understand medicine. You have to understand taking care of critically ill patients, because at some point your patients become like that, but you also have to understand this combination of how like the mind works the body, and when things break down, how they can affect things, and even how medicines and treatments affect each other. So, as difficult as it was and as challenging as it was, and like, I was like, what am I doing? I'm in psych. Like, why am I sitting here like putting a line in somebody's neck and like barely trying to keep them alive? And why are patients dying on me? When you look at the experiences, it really kind of shapes how you approach what you do, and really taking it in a bigger picture and understand I'm taking care of people, right? I'm not taking care of somebody with depression or somebody with anxiety. I'm taking care of a person who has potentially struggles with anxiety or depression, but has other physical issues, has other families. So you start to see it in the context. And I think it's important. And then within psychiatry, for me, for residency, we did rotations in different units. So one was mood disorders, one was eating disorders, one was young adults, one was geriatric population, one was chronic pain, one was schizophrenia, like psychotic disorder. So one was substance use. So we started, where I trained, having experience working in inpatient units with a lot of the different kind of psychiatric illnesses, if you will, and the variety of all that. And that allowed me to get more experience taking care of more patients with again, different psychiatric issues. And then it just kind of goes on about just, you have different rotations, different experiences. and all those things. And so when it's all said and done, like I said, after high school, I had another 13 years of education and training before I'm actually
Yeah.
kind of ready to start making money and pay back all my loan.
And so walk us through a little bit about that point when you finally are done with that 13 years. Where do you go from there?
Yeah. So, people can go different places, right? Some people stay in academics and they stay within like that clinical setting. And I think for a lot of people, it's what's nice is that's kind of how you've been trained, right? You've been trained in schools and in hospitals. And so being able to stay and be able to continue to teach and educate and learn, I think is a very great option. For me, I knew that I wanted to do something in athletics. I wanted to do something in sports. I knew I had sort of an entrepreneurial desire. Again, I talked about my father working a lot, and he really worked and he worked, but his whole thing was, I want to take care of people. And he could have advanced a lot further as far as having, you know, uh, sort of advancements in certain ways, but his really primary thing was, I just want to take care of people. I want to help people. And so he was very humble in that way. And while I have a fair amount of humility, I also have this need to like want to be a greater version of myself and looking at other people and saying, well, if they can be the best at what they're doing, why can't I be the best? And if I know I can be the best, then I owe it to myself to try to do that. And so for me, there was this need to want to go out and expand and be able to put myself in a position to grow. And that for me was not going to happen in an inpatient setting or in an academic setting. And so what I decided to do was I decided to do something in private practice, but I also decided to stay on the faculty and teach, right? It's always been a theme that's kind of come back to my life. So, I decided to stay on the faculty at Hopkins and teach a course for the residents. So I did that. And then initially I worked in a couple of different private practices. I also worked for like an inner city crisis response team. So I worked with different populations, right? I worked within the hospital setting, working with residents. I also worked with kind of outpatient patients that were maybe middle upper class, and then also worked with sort of more of a kind of inner city population within the crisis response team. So I got a lot of different experience. I kind of had like 4 or 5 different jobs. So I was always bouncing, like in the morning I was in one place, in the afternoon I was in one place. But it also allowed me to see, I thought I knew what I wanted to do, but again, you think you know what you want to do, and then you get out there and you actually start to do it, and you realize that your career goals may change. And they say, I think most people within the first 1 to 3 years change their job, right? So I put myself in a position where I was able to change if I wanted to, and having that different experience didn't kind of pigeonhole me into one thing. I also had I was very fortunate because of my father and because of his colleagues to have a lot of people that were interested in me. So I interviewed with a ton of people. I interviewed in programs that I never even wanted to go into just to learn more. And so I started to get a sense of like what it was like in the real world and what the lay of the land was like and who the players were and who were the situations. So going out allowed me to be able to have those connections and also know that I may not be doing what I want to do now, but I now have connections that if I wanted a job or even I just want to learn and get more kind of professional growth, I had all that. And that to me is part of employment, right? Like you don't get paid for it, but it's a part of growing as a professional is talking to other people in the field, learning what people do, how they approach it. It's not just about like showing up and diagnosing, in my case, diagnosing a disorder, prescribing a pill, and then being able to move on. It's about understanding like, this is a part of the psychiatric experience. This is what people do. This is how people think. These are what the different, resources are available, right? Because at some point your patient is going to need to potentially go to an inpatient or substance abuse program or a group home or whatever. And if you don't know how they work and you don't know who those people are, it's harder to get access. So even by establishing those connections, I knew I was setting myself up to be able to provide better access and care for my patients. And so those relationships also cultivated, which I think are important. And, I did that for a year and then I thought, you know what, this is what I want to do with my practice. So I transitioned and kind of condensed it and had a private practice and then still stayed on the faculty at Hopkins. And eventually the inner city crisis response team kind of dropped off because it was taking more time away and it wasn't being run in the way that I was, I thought that maybe it should have been. And there was obviously some, other organizational issues and limitations with that. So, it's just grown as my career has gone in the last 11 years, it's grown. And, several years ago, I started seeing more and more athletes for like performance related issues. And, injuries and post kind of concussion psychiatric issues or post surgical psychiatric issues, and then sort of performance anxiety. And I started thinking, and as I was working with them, I was tying in my experiences athletically and some of my knowledge, and I was seeing an impact, and kids really saying, man, Dr. T, this is awesome. Like, I've never heard this before. And parents are like, I've never heard this before. Or even better yet, they were like, I always tell my kid this, and now they're listening to you and not you. And I'm saying differently. Yeah. And I'm a doctor, and it's a different voice. But I started to see, wow, like, we can all give similar messages, but in a different way. And if I have this ability and being in this unique position, there's really an impact that I make. So I actually started creating programs and content for teams, for coaches, for parents, for medical professionals about psychiatric, recognizing psychiatric vulnerabilities, promoting confidence, improving resilience, ultimately promoting performance, improving performance. So I started doing all of these things, and it started to really kind of grow. And so now in the last several years, I've created the Mindset Training Institute, which is part of me. It's what I do, but I have my psychiatric practice, and then I work with teams, I work with organizations, I work with first responders, parents, coaches, and then I have a lot of individual high performance athletes that work with me in terms of improving their mindset. And I think, what's unique about what I do is, and it's not to diminish what a sports psychologist would do or what a consultant would do, but it's taking those concepts and explaining kind of medically what's happening within the brain and the body, and then what we can do about it. So instead of just saying, like, if you believe it, you could achieve it, or, right. Together we all achieve more, or believe in yourself, or be positive. Like, these are all great sayings, and I say this all the time, but like, you have to explain to somebody how to utilize it and what it actually does. And once you show them and explain to them scientifically what's happening in a way that they can understand, then they're going to get more buy-in, and they're going to be able to work through those challenges. And so that's been a really cool thing, because like, now I'm on the mat with these kids. Like, I'm on the field with these kids. Like, you know what I mean? And it's been able to really kind of combine that and grow that. And it's been a lot of fun. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah. I mean, it's coaching in just a different way. I want to back up a little bit, because you were talking about kind of building connections and building relationships and basically networking. And this is something I notice with my students, that they struggle with figuring out how to do that, especially kind of starting out in their career. So do you have any advice on how to start doing that?
Yeah, just ask people. Like, I think the first thing is we overcomplicate it. We think either people are too busy, or they're not available, or we've already decided what they're going to say before they've even said it. And so I think one thing is just ask them, because number one, identify, like, within your field, who are people within your field, right? It doesn't have to be the top of, but just identify, like, who are the players in the game, right? And then reach out to them, like, send an email, send a phone call, do a phone call or whatever. Understand these are human beings. And at some point they were likely in your position where they were getting ready to do their career or go in what they wanted to do, and somebody helped them. And think about, and for those of us who have had help, and anyone who's successful in this world, I think, can say that we've had some help, right? It's very hard to be successful in this world without help. So those of us who recognize how important that is, we're willing to also give back. We're also willing to reach out. So, every email that I get, I mean, I've got on my case slide over 700 active patients. Like, I'm busy, right? I work with a bunch of teams. I work with a bunch of individuals. I have my own podcast now. Like, I have a family. Like, but if somebody takes the time to email me and has a genuine question about, listen, I want to learn about what you do, or I'm interested in this, I take time to respond, because I remember being the kid that, my father's colleagues or friends took an interest in me, right? I remember being the kid that wanted to get better, in my wrestling career. And when a coach stayed after to work with me, or drove me to a wrestling tournament, or took me out of state to be able to help me, get better competition, I remember how meaningful that was for me, and how that sort of solidified, like, this is why I want to do this. And so, like, we're all there. And those of us who have gotten so big that we're unavailable to reach out, then that's something we need to look at. But let them tell you no, right? Like, don't tell yourself no. Right. I think one is find out who's in the game, reach out, but be also follow up. Like, a lot of times we'll send an email and then we don't hear anything, and we're like, oh, they're not going to contact me. But like, no, follow up with a phone call. Like, make that effort. Sometimes depending on what the job is, like, go to the job, like go to the, when you're able to, like go and find out and say, listen, I know so-and-so's available. Is there a time that I could set up to meet? Like if you take that initiative to show up, right, in any capacity, right, whether it's via an email or show up via phone call or show up in person, you're showing that you're interested. And it's going to take sometimes more than one thing. But I think we're so used now to doing everything so via technology and sending emails and blah, 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 that like we don't recognize that it might get lost. Like we'll fill out a resume. The course I teach, by the way, at Hopkins, it's called Transition to Practice. It's about how to get a job. Like that's the course I teach. And so I'm teaching doctors. These are doctors who are so smart. They're at the top of their field. They're at Johns Hopkins Hospital, which in psychiatry is ranked #1 in the country. They don't know how to get jobs. And I teach them like how to interview, how to follow up. And this concept of like, what do you mean like make a phone call? Like, no, I just like fill out the resume and send it in. I'm like, you know how many resumes they get? Like, but if you follow up, you set yourself apart, right? If 99% of people are just filling out a resume on Indeed, and you're the 1% that actually takes your resume in, or you follow up with a phone call and say, hey, I just want to make sure you got my resume. Is there anything else you need? You're already ahead, right? And I think it's this idea of building relationships, understanding these are human beings. So we have to establish ourselves as a human being that cares. And if you can do that, then you're building a connection. And that connection can go really, really far. Even if you don't get that job, that relationship can form and you never know when it's going to play out. And they might say, hey, we don't have an opportunity, but you know what? I really like that conversation I had with you. I've got a friend in blah, 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 or let me put you in touch with so-and-so. And that's how it grows, right? And that's how these podcasts grow. Like we interview people and we know people and they say, hey, you're really cool and you've got a great story. And let me put you in touch with, Brittany and let's now do this. And then it just kind of grows. And it's such a cool part of the experience. And it produces content and it, gets you exposure. But at the end of it, you're really creating relationships. And it's just on the ability, it's that opportunity of just reaching out.
Yeah, I love the idea of humanizing the people you're reaching out to. That's what I tell my students all the time is to think of, I think there becomes these power dynamics where the people in the career seem so much more powerful than us. And so we get a little bit nervous, but it's basic psychology, which, it's name recognition, it's familiarity. If you put your name out there, if you're reaching out, you're setting yourself apart. They're all humans. They're going to go for what's kind of easiest, right? That's what our brain loves to do is easiest path. And so if you set yourself apart, now it's a little bit easier for them to kind of pick from the pile.
And also think about this, right? Like people want to be liked. People want you to pay attention to them, right? Like that's how people are. So regardless of how big you are, like the bigger you become, the more distant people become from you. So if you can bridge that gap and actually show an interest in that person by reaching out to them personally, right? Or finding a way to get to them, then you're telling them, listen, I'm interested in what you do. I value you. I want to know more about what you're doing. And the biggest person, right? You bring them back to like when they were a kid and they wanted to be liked. So you're inviting them to sit at your lunch table, right? Or you're saying to them, can I sit at your lunch table, right? And when you do that, that's when the conversation happens, right? And that's when the relationship forms. But if we keep it so distant and it goes through all these different channels, then the problem is it's challenging. And sometimes, look, you're going to have to go through the assistant or you're going to have to go through the whatever. But at the end of the day, we're all human beings. And even the biggest people in the world got there because of relationships and connections, right? And somebody helped them along the way. And if you're polite and you're articulate and you show interest and you've done a little bit of your homework and you're the one person that reaches out, that literally is you coming up and saying, hey, do you mind if I sit with you? Right? Or, hey, do you mind do you want to join me? Like when it all comes down to it, it all goes back to like that basic thing. And that really cuts through so many of all the other things. I mean, we all have a bunch of awards on our walls. We all have a bunch of diplomas. Our bios all look great. But at the end of it, like we're people and we crave those relationships and those meaningful relationships. And if you can make it more about quality than quantity, then again, like you're so much further ahead of your competition. And that's not that hard to do. And guess what? If you get rejected, you're no worse off than if you had never reached out to begin with.
Yeah, that's a big thing that I've been trying to work on telling people recently is to not tell yourself no. That was something that I had to learn personally.
No. Yeah, make them say no.
Make other people tell you no.
Spot. Why do you have to be in that spot? Put them in the tough spot. And then they have to say no. But you know what? Give them a reason that they can't say no. Like show them, hey, I care. I've done my homework. I also talk about, like, if you're interviewing or if you're in that position, like, find out a little bit about the person and what actually is valuable to them, and make a personal connection, right? Like, I know you're interested in this. I also have an interest in, like, when you're in an interview, look around the room. If you see a picture of them with, like, horseback riding, like, and that's something you have an interest in, like, draw that human connection, because again, it goes beyond the job. And a lot of people are like, but that has nothing to do with the job. I'm like, listen, at the end of it, if you get this job, you're going to be working with that person. And what better people to work with than people that you have common interests in? So, like, look for those opportunities. And if you look for them, by the way, you're more likely to find them.
Yeah, and people just love talking about themselves. So if you ask people about themselves, they're likely to respond.
So give them a chance. Give them the privilege of being able to talk about themselves, right? So you're doing them a favor, right? Reaching out to them, and then they talk about themselves, and then you find commonalities, and now you've made them feel actually human and interested. And it's not about, like, who they are as a CEO or what they can offer you. It's about, like, who they are as a person, and that sets you apart as well. So there's so many variabilities to it, but at the end, it's really about establishing that connection. And it's hard to put yourself out there, but it's like anything else. Like, if you want to go out on a date, you have to ask somebody out, right? Like, if you want to,
Right.
you know, you want to get the answer in a class, you have to ask the teacher the question, right? Like, it's in anything we've learned from the very, very beginning. You have to put yourself out there. But when you do, you get the answer from the teacher. You get the yes from, the person, and you go out on that amazing date, or you get the job. The reward is so much more valuable, and any discomfort that you went through is totally worth it.
Right. And do you have any advice for maybe people that have a heightened sense of anxiety right now? I know, like, Generation Z has probably the highest anxiety of any generation previously. So it's maybe a little bit more difficult. Is there something to help overcome that anxiety?
Yeah, I mean, I think one is recognize, this is the other thing that comes up, and I appreciate you asking that, is, a lot of times we want to get rid of anxiety, right? Like, we want to get rid of the anxiety. We want to get rid of doubt. A lot of the athletes that come to me, they're like, I want to get rid of the anxiety. And I'm like, look, you're not going to get rid of it. It's a part of the experience, right? And I think part of it is understanding that the more complicated, the faster life gets, and the more complicated life gets, and the more access we have to information more quickly, the more anxiety we're going to have, right? Because we see what we don't have, we see what we want, we perceive what we think other people have. So, like, there's all this information that gets flooded in, where now we feel like we have to process it all, and so we're going to have more anxiety. So part of it is recognizing that it's a typical part of our human experience. It doesn't mean we're flawed. It doesn't mean that there's something wrong with us. That's one thing. The other thing is recognizing when it's really limiting us, then again, asking for help, right? Accessing and saying, listen, this is bothering me. You don't have to know why it's happening or what to do about it. You just have to recognize if it's bothering you, then you ask for help. If you ask for help, somebody can work with you to figure out how to navigate it, right? And that's another thing. So I think, number one, understanding it's there. Number two, if it's limiting you or making you uncomfortable, either ask yourself, what can I do? Or ask for help. And I think the other thing then is really focus. A lot of times then we focus on all these things that we can't do because of it. Well, I can't do this. It's too hard. I can't do that. And then our parents, right, are just like, just do it. Just do it. Like, what do you mean it's too hard? Well, that's not helpful, because that just kind of diminishes your experience. But the other thing I'm really, really big on is asking yourself, okay, when you figure out these are all these things I can't do, then asking yourself, what can I do? Right? Like, what's one thing I can do? Well, you know what? I can draft an email. So let me send this email out. Or I can learn more about this job, right? Let me do that. You know what I mean? I can look around and see what other opportunities are. So I think what you do then is, instead of we feel like we have to make the decision about, are we going to get it? Are we not? Is it the right job for me? And so we get overwhelmed. And fundamentally, it's like, well, wait a second. Like, you don't have to decide all that, because you don't even have the job yet. Why don't you, what you can do is learn more about these jobs, fill out these applications, right? Ask questions, connect with these people. These are all action-oriented items. But by focusing on the action, then you're diminishing kind of the thoughts and the fears. And so, I don't know how many of your listeners are know about the field of psychology, but when I really, really simplified the field of psychology and psychiatry to some extent, it comes down to like one simple triangle. And it's the fact that the way that we think affects how we feel, which affects what we do, right? And if you think about a triangle with thoughts at the top, actions in one corner, and feelings in the other corner, then if we're stuck in our thoughts and we're stuck in our feeling and we don't know how to change that, then what we can do is change our action. And if we change our action, that's going to impact the way that we think or that we feel. So a lot of times, and I joke about this. I say, look, in the mental health field, we think and we feel way too much, right? But like sometimes you can't just think it, you can't just feel it. You got to just do it, right? Like if you just do it, then you're going to be able then to get out of your head and be able to be more action oriented. You're going to be able to get out of your feelings and be able to be more successful. And fundamentally, like, listen, at the end of the day, Nike made billions and billions of dollars off the expression, just do it. Not just think we'll just do it. Right? Right. So if it works for them, why can't it work for us? So like sometimes, and it doesn't mean just do it, like do something big. Sometimes it means just do something small, like get up and go to the next room, get up and get a drink of water, take a shower, sit down and say, all right, let me just send one email. Let me make one phone call. Like just one little thing can then trigger this sense of like accomplishment, which is going to build your confidence, which is going to reduce your anxiety. So it's still there, but it's not affecting or impairing you as much. And I think that's incredibly important. Is a lot of times we can't choose that we have anxiety, and we have it, and it stinks and it's uncomfortable, but we can choose what we do and what we respond. And if we're constantly battling the thoughts, then we get stuck. But sometimes if we look at an actionable item that we can do, and identify that I can't control these things, but like the other expression I use, control the controllables. Like if you look at what can I control, then it starts to become more within you empower yourself, and you're able to kind of manage that a lot better.
When I like the small steps, I used to have tiny goals. Like if I was at a conference, I would try to ask one question during a panel or something, or, oh, I'm just going to send this one email, or I'm going to send this one tweet or this DM or whatever it is. And you're right. It's kind of like a feedback loop. The more I've done it, the more positive feedback I've gotten, the more experiences I've gotten, the more opportunities I've gotten, the more connections I've gotten. And now that anxiety, you're right, is still there. But I can send those emails a lot quicker now than I used to in the beginning, because I know, okay, I have, an 80% success rate or something like that. So this is likely to be good. And if it's not, honestly, I'll probably forget that I ever sent the email by the time it comes back anyways. And so it starts to get easier over time once you've done those kind of small steps, and then you can start moving to like bigger steps.
Yeah, you train yourself, you train your brain to realize I can do it, because again, the thought and the fear is you can't. And then you do one little small step, and then you start to be like, wait, I didn't die. Like I did it. And then all of a sudden you get a response. You're like, holy crap, I got a response. So then you're like, wait a second. So if I actually reach out, I increase my chance of getting a response. And if I get a response, then I'm more excited. And if I'm more excited, I'm more likely to do it. And if I'm more likely to do it, I get more response. If I get more response, I'm more likely to get a job that I want. Like, how cool is this? And then you get excited, and your brain gets excited, and brains love to learn. And then all these chemicals start getting secreted. And it's like, it totally, like you said, it really reinforces it. And then when things are tough, you can draw upon that and be like, I've done this before. I've been okay. Like, all I have, and it's not always easy. It's not always like you just then keep asking questions and sending emails, but you've been there before, and you've thought that before, and you've overcome it. So you can draw upon those experiences, and those things become incredibly meaningful, right? Just like in life, again, my experiences in my childhood with my teachers and my coaches and my father and these other things have shaped how I work with patients. Now I work with families, but also when I have younger kind of career-minded people, individuals that reach out and say, hey, I want to learn more about your field, or, can I meet with you? I look at the fact that they made that effort, that reached out to me. I'm going to reward that, because I know how hard that was. I know it was, because I was there. Yeah. So to me, a lot of times, I've had athletes or kids, they're like, thanks for calling me back so quickly. I'm like, of course. They're like, I didn't think I would hear back from you. I'm like, why? They're like, I'm like, look, you made an effort. I know it was hard for you to send me an email. You don't know me, but it was clearly well thought out. I read your email. It was articulate. You clearly did your research, and you knew enough about me, and you were able to articulate why it was important for me to respond. Of course I'm going to respond. And like, I'm no different than any other top CEO or top professional athlete or anybody else. Like, I'm a human being.
I'm always surprised at how many people say yes and will meet with you. I tell students all the time to ask them for a coffee. Like, just go take them to the Starbucks on campus, and you'd be amazed how many professors, how many employers would say yes.
Used to get away from their work, right? Like you're giving them a legitimate Because they can say, you know what, I don't have to send this email right now because you know what, I'm having coffee with so-and-so. Like, how cool is it to give them like that gift of time and about again, bringing them back to the lunch table? Totally, totally.
Yeah, and then just setting yourself up for opportunities. So applying, you were mentioning a little while ago, like just apply to different jobs and apply to different things, because I constantly tell students looking to go into either graduate school or careers, they'll kind of limit themselves. They'll be like, oh, well, I can't get into that clinical psych program, so I'm never going to apply. And I just had a student the other day who got an interview with her top choice clinical psych program because she ended up actually applying. So putting yourself out there and letting yourself make that decision maybe once you get the opportunity, rather than making the decision before you even attempt the opportunity. Yeah, basically allowing yourself to reach out for opportunities. So I've had a lot of students trying to apply for jobs or apply to graduate programs, and they'll limit themselves before they even go for the opportunity. So I had recently this week, a couple of months ago, I had a student applying to clinical psych graduate programs, and those are extremely difficult to get into right now. And she was like, well, I'm not going to apply because I'm probably not going to get in. And I was like, well, just apply. Like, let them tell you no. Don't limit yourself. And then she came back this week and said she got an interview at her top choice. So it's kind of put yourself out there for the opportunities, let them tell you yes or no. And then you can make a decision. If you get like multiple offers, at that point, you can make a decision. You don't always have to make a decision prior to kind of reaching out.
No, I think that's important. The other thing is then if you at least then learn what you need to work on, right? Like, you're not going to know truthfully what you need to improve on or what you can improve on unless you get that feedback. So, for example, if they say no, then you have an opportunity to potentially say, well, I really appreciate it. Is there anything that I need to know or anything that I can work on? They might say, you know what, we just have a really competitive year and like your application was great and any other year, would have been great. And we would ask that, you reapply. Or they might say, you know what, the one thing you were lacking is maybe if you took more courses in this, or if you actually got more clinical experience in this or whatever. But then you're not going to know unless you actually have that experience and have that setback. And again, I'm a big believer that like, we can't always choose what happens, but we can choose how we react. So like these failures, we can look at them as learning opportunities. And anybody that's ever been successful has failed multiple times. And if you look at like the top, again, I work a lot with athletes. So if you look at the top athletes in the world, like Michael Jordan, for example, one of his most famous quotes is, "I've failed over and over and over and over again." He says it 4 times, and that's why I've succeeded. So like, you're not going to succeed unless you fail, and you're not going to fail unless you put yourself in these positions. And that's the only way you grow. So I also think it's like, you can learn all this stuff in a book, but that's not going to prepare you for the real world. That's just going to give you the background. And the only way to actually put yourself out there is to be able to put yourself out there. And frankly, why are you going to go to all that school if you're not trying to put yourself out there to get a job? Like, then what? Like, what's the point of that? So if you made that decision, the hardest part was deciding and doing the work, but then let them tell you no. But then if they do, find out a way to learn from it, right? And if you do that, then and each one of these setbacks is only going to set you up for a better opportunity down the road. I mean, that's the other thing, right? Like, it's okay to have these setbacks if you use them as learning opportunities, because they're only going to make you greater and better, and you're going to appreciate it more, and you're going to work harder, and you're going to know how fragile it is. If you just got your first job right off the bat and it was great, it wouldn't be that fulfilling and satisfying. And frankly, there may be a point where you're just not enjoying it as much, but like, the struggle in and of itself is a part of the process. And it's also what makes it so enjoyable when you actually get it.
Right. And there's no shame in failing once and keep going, right? So personally, I didn't get accepted into a PhD program the first time I applied. And it set me up for a better opportunity. I ended up getting a great opportunity to spend some time at Harvard and work with people there and really learn from new and amazing people. And the next opportunity I got was better. So I like that idea of sometimes your failures, not only can you learn from them, but they might set you up for a better opportunity later on.
Yeah, totally. And that's the thing. Not only is there no shame in it, like, number one, we talked about anxiety being a part of the experience. We all fail. If we're going to be successful, we have to fail. So number one is there's no shame in it. It's a part of the experience. It's very typical. But the other thing is, if you think of it as a learning opportunity, the more learning opportunities you have, the more you can grow. And the more you can grow, the more successful you're going to be. So if your goal ultimately is to be an average, mediocre professional, then go for the first job and take it and whatever. But if you understand, like, okay, that didn't work out, or get the first job and then figure out, how can I get even better? How can I grow? What can I learn in this situation? So whatever the outcome is, whether it's yes or no, then use it as an opportunity to grow. And so your setbacks become lessons, your successes become lessons, but everything becomes lessons, and it allows you to become more grow, and it keeps you more hungrier, right? Because if you're very complacent, somebody else is going to come along and they're going to have 3 or 4 setbacks behind you, but then they're going to jump you. So if you're willing to work and grow and learn from these experiences, then not only are they less scary, but you also realize, like, okay, like, this is part of it. Like, I'm supposed to get some rejections. Like, you know, you just look at all these, you look at all these experiences in life. Like, even people that are married, most of us have dated more than one person before we got married, right? So we had failures. Like, our relationships have failed, and like a lot of us have had more than one failure.
Right.
Like, but that's what allows us to learn about ourselves, learn about what we want in a person, like what we're willing to tolerate, what we're not. And ultimately, you go through enough of those failures, and hopefully you find the person that you're like, wow, I'm lucky to be with this person. And that person's like, I'm lucky to be with this person. And you value it more, and you grow together.
Yeah.
But like, that's like anything that's meaningful in life, you gotta fail a little bit. It's part of it.
Well, and then also realizing that once you get that dream job, or let's say even marriage that you were talking about now, like you still fail in your marriage
100%.
on days. There's still bad days. You're still not doing everything perfect in that dream job. There's still parts of that dream job you don't like. There's still failures within that dream job. And I think there might be this perception that you kind of get to this place and then all of a sudden it's just that happily ever after or whatever is expected. And it's, no, you still fail, you still work, you still have to kind of put in that time and effort.
Yeah. So, and I think it's how we define the word fail. So I think you'll appreciate this, but the word fail is spelled FAIL, right?
Mm-hmm.
I've reframed and redefined the word fail as first attempt in learning.
Nice.
So,
I like that.
right? And if you fail more than once, which most of us do, it's further attempts in learning. So if you think about the definition of fail as a first attempt in learning or further attempt in learning, who doesn't want to learn more? Like,
right.
How you grow. So then you realize, okay, like, a failure is not a setback, or it's not a, a knock on who I am or how capable I am. It's an opportunity to learn, right? And if I use it as such, then I get more motivated, I get more excited, and then I put more effort into whatever I'm doing, and then I'm more likely to have successes, right? Which also means I'm more likely to have failures. But that's part of the growth process. And you're absolutely right. Like, you get to a job, you're going to have setbacks. Like, you get to, your dream marriage, right? And you marry like the person in your dreams, like, you're going to have differences. You're going to have setbacks. And if you're prepared to identify that and realize that doesn't define you, or it doesn't define the relationship, or it doesn't define the experience, it's an opportunity to learn more, then everything becomes more meaningful and everything becomes more rewarding. And ultimately, you're more successful in anything.
Right.
And that's important. So, yeah.
All right. Well, we're coming up at the end of the hour. So I usually like to end with just, for anybody starting out in a career kind of similar to yours, do you have kind of one big piece of advice you might want to give them?
Yeah. So if you're going to do it for the money, don't. I think find something you're passionate about, whatever profession you are, and find a way to make it work within that. So I think in medicine, for example, a lot of people that go into medicine think, I want to be a doctor because, I'm helping people and it's good money and blah, blah. And then there's all these limitations, right? Like, you have a lot of student loans, you have a lot of debt, you have a lot of insurance companies, you have a lot of challenges. But I think if you fundamentally go in to anything and you identify kind of like what your why is, people always talk about your why. Like, if you identify what your reason is and you come back to that passion, then you'll be able to make anything work. But it's the ability to look at that, because when you have those setbacks or those failures, or you have that anxiety, and you can go back and say, well, what am I really trying to do? Like, what's my reason and what's my passion? Then I think you'll make it work. And for me, again, teaching and coaching was what I wanted to do. For a lot of reasons I went into medicine, but if that was the only thing that motivated me or drove me was the medicine piece, then I'd be really unhappy. But sort of then saying, well, wait a second, how can I take a medical degree and still be a teacher and a coach? right? That's what kind of really drove me and allowed me to become more creative in what I do and fundamentally be able to allow me, I think, better. I'm definitely not the smartest person in my field. I'm not the most experienced person in my field. But I think the reason I'm so successful in what I do is because I go back to what motivated me when I was really, really young, and I find a way to bring that in. So I think if you can do that, you can keep it fun, you can keep it interesting. And it's like that whole thing about like dreams do come true. They just don't necessarily go the way you want them to be. But
Right.
sometimes they can be even bigger, right? Like to a lot of people would say, well, you wanted to be a teacher and a coach, now you're a doctor. And I'm like, yeah, well, my parents wanted to be a doctor, but now I'm a teacher and a coach. How cool is that? So it really comes down to, like, do what you want. You can find a way to do what you want in any capacity if you really identify with what's important to you. That's what I would say.
Great. I like that. Well, thank you so much for coming on today.
I appreciate it. This was fun.
Thank you for listening to the Career Journey Podcast. Head over to our website at careerjourneypodcast.com for more information and the latest episodes. See you next time.